सत्य हिंदी के इस कार्यक्रम में हम हमेशा किसी खास किताब पर चर्चा करते हैं। कभी कोई किसी की जीवनी होती है तो कभी कोई उपन्यास। हमारी कोशिश रहती है कि सोशल मीडिया की फर्जी भागदौड़ के जमाने में हम आपको उन किताबों से भी परिचित करवाते रहें जो समय के साथ साथ लिखी जा रही हैं और उनके बारे में आपको जानना जरूरी है। आज भी हम एक ऐसी किताब पर चर्चा करेंगे या कहें कि एक ऐसे शख्स पर चर्चा करेंगे जो हमारे देश के प्रधानमंत्री रहे, जिनका विजन बहुत साफ और आधुनिक बताया जाता है, जिन्होंने कभी विचारधारा से समझौता नहीं किया, लेकिन फिर भी देश में खासकर उत्तर भारत में उनके बारे में आपको बहुत कम सामग्री मिल पाती है। ना तो उनके बारे में पीआर किया जाता है और ना ही बड़े बड़े नेता उनके नाम को रैलियों में कहते हुए सुने जाते हैं। हालांकि पीएम मोदी ने उनका नाम कई बार लिया था, जबकि वो पीएम मोदी की विचारधारा के धुर विरोधी रहे हैं। दरअसल मैं बात कर रहा हूं देश के प्रधानमंत्री रहे, कर्नाटक के मुख्यमंत्री रहे एचडी देवेगौड़ा की। उनकी बायोग्राफी लिखी गई है, नाम है फरोज इन अ फील्ड द अनएक्सप्लोर्ड लाइफ ऑफ एचडी देवेगौड़ा। इसको लिखा है वरिष्ठ पत्रकार और लेखक सुगाता श्रीनिवास राजू ने, जो पिछले 25 वर्षों की पत्रकारिता में उच्च पदों पर रहे हैं। इसको पब्लिश किया है पेंगुइन रैंडम हाउस ने। लेखक इस किताब में पूर्व प्रधानमंत्री गौड़ा की राजनीति ही नहीं बल्कि एक शख्स एचडी देवेगौड़ा को सामने लाए हैं। उन्होंने उनके हर पहलू को शब्द दिए हैं। ईमानदारी से कहूं तो किताब पढ़ने के बाद ही मुझे पता चला कि मैंने अभी तक एचडी देवेगौड़ा के बारे में जानने की कोशिश क्यों नहीं की। इस किताब में देश के एक सेकुलर नेता के अनछुए व्यक्तित्व को सामने रखा गया है। कहने को तो मैं कट्टर सेकुलर भी कह सकता हूं, लेकिन कट्टर शब्द जिसके साथ लग जाता है वो अच्छी भली चीज खराब हो जाती है, इसलिए इसका प्रयोग नहीं किया। हालांकि आजकल एक नेता कट्टर ईमानदारी जैसे शब्दों का प्रयोग कर रहे हैं। लेखक ने इस किताब में बताया कि कैसे एचडी देवेगौड़ा देश की राजनीति में बाहरी रहे। उनके पहले के अन्य प्रधानमंत्रियों के पास या तो सामाजिक पूंजी, सांस्कृतिक पूंजी थी या वे हिंदी बेल्ट से थे, लेकिन इनके पास ऐसा कुछ भी नहीं था। नरेंद्र मोदी के विपरीत गौड़ा को किसी भी संगठन ने भी आगे नहीं बढ़ाया था। बिल्कुल जमीन से आए इस नेता का नाम साइकिल मैन भी पड़ गया था। छोटे से किसान के परिवार से निकले गौड़ा किसी कैसे देश की राजनीति में अभी तक बने हुए हैं। कभी भी बड़े पदों पर लंबे समय तक न रहने के बावजूद भी कैसे वो देश की राजनीति में प्रासंगिक बने हुए हैं। क्यों उनके नाम पर पंजाब के किसानों ने चावल की एक किस्म का नाम रखा है। इसके अलावा भी बहुत कुछ जानेंगे। वो इतने लंबे समय से राजनीति में बने हुए हैं कि हम उनके जीवन पर चर्चा करने के साथ साथ हम भारत की पूरी राजनीति पर चर्चा कर सकते हैं। देश की राजनीति का हर उतार चढ़ाव उनके सामने या उनकी मौजूदगी में घटा है। इसलिए अब इस कार्यक्रम को आगे बढ़ाते हैं और कार्यक्रम में किताब पर विस्तृत चर्चा तब होगी जब इस कार्यक्रम की बागडोर थामेंगे सत्य हिंदी के वरिष्ठ पत्रकार आशुतोष और आलोक जोशी। लेकिन वो इस कार्यक्रम को बढ़ाएं उससे पहले एक दो बात मैं बता देता हूं जिसके लिए मैं जुड़ा हुआ हूं, और वो ये है, अगर कोई सवाल पूछना चाहता है, आपको इस कार्यक्रम को सुनते सुनते आपके दिमाग में कोई सवाल उठता है और वो आप इस किताब के लेखक यानी कि सुगता जी से सवाल पूछना चाहते हैं तो आप पूछ सकते हैं। उसके लिए अगर आप रजिस्टर करके जुड़ेंगे जूम के जरिए तो आपको नीचे स्क्रीन पर दो ऑप्शन दिखेंगे, एक Q&A का है यानी कि सवाल टाइप करके भेजें, और दूसरा आप चर्चा के अंत में सीधे बातचीत भी कर सकते हैं। उसके लिए आपको हैंड रेज का विकल्प का इस्तेमाल करना होगा। तो यहाँ से इस कार्यक्रम को आगे बढ़ाएंगे। आशुतोष सर, ओवर टू यू।
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया अंकुर, धन्यवाद बहुत बहुत। दरअसल एचडी देवेगौड़ा के बारे में किताब पढ़ना मेरे लिए तो कम से कम ऐसा था कि इतिहास के गलियारों से एक बार गुजरना, क्योंकि जब एचडी देवेगौड़ा को देश का प्रधानमंत्री चुना गया उस वक्त मैं एक छोटा सा रिपोर्टर था और मैं आज तक में काम किया करता था। मुझे अच्छी तरीके से याद है कि जब यूनाइटेड फ्रंट के तमाम बड़े नेता राष्ट्रपति भवन गए और राष्ट्रपति से मिलने के लिए बाहर निकले और तब तक हम सब लोग वहां बाहर खड़े हुए थे, कैमरे के साथ माइक बाइट ले रहे थे और देवेगौड़ा उस भीड़ में सबसे पीछे खड़े थे। तो सबने कहा कि भाई प्रधानमंत्री पद की जो उम्मीदवार है वो है कहां। तो फिर वो आगे आए और उन्होंने बाइट दी। ये मेरा एचडी देवेगौड़ा से दूसरा परिचय था। पहला परिचय ये था कि इस घटना के कुछ समय पहले वो कर्नाटका भवन में टिके थे मुख्यमंत्री के तौर पर और मैं उनका इंटरव्यू करने के लिए गया था और तब किसी को नहीं मालूम था कि एचडी देवेगौड़ा कुछ समय के बाद देश के प्रधानमंत्री बनने वाले हैं। और उसके बाद का जो पूरा घटनाक्रम है आज भी मेरी आंखों के सामने चलचित्र की तरह चलता है। तो आज जब मैं इस किताब को पढ़ रहा था, इस किताब बहुत मोटी किताब है, 500 पेज की किताब है और इसका दाम 799 रुपए है। इतनी मोटी किताब एचडी देवेगौड़ा पे लिखी जा सकती है ये मैं नहीं सोच रहा था, क्योंकि मुझे लग रहा था एचडी देवेगौड़ा की जिंदगी में ऐसी कौन सी चीज है जो हम लोगों को नहीं मालूम है। लेकिन जब मैंने इस किताब को पढ़ा तो बहुत ही रोचक तरीके से इस किताब को लिखा गया है और इसके लिए किताब के लेखक सुगता श्रीनिवास राजू जो इस वक्त हमारे साथ मौजूद है उनका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। लेकिन हमारे उन तमाम उत्तर भारत के दर्शकों से मेरा एक निवेदन है कि आज की जो हमारी बातचीत है वो पूरी तरीके से हिंदी में नहीं होगी, क्योंकि जाहिर सी बात है सुगता श्रीनिवास राजू हिंदी समझते हैं, लेकिन उनको हो सकता है कुछ जगह हिंदी बोलने में दिक्कत हो, तो हमारी बातचीत आज बाइलिंगुअल होगी, इंग्लिश में भी होगी। तो बहुत बहुत थैंक यू सो मच सुगता ज्वाइनिंग दिस
thank you,
writing
Ashutosh.
this thick book. First, you let me know, why did you write this book? What was the reason that forced you to write this book?
Thank you very much, Ashutosh, for having me on your show. मेरा हिंदी इतना बढ़िया नहीं है, इसीलिए थोड़ा अंग्रेजी मिक्स करके बात कर लेता हूँ. And that is the real tradition of India. India is a bilingual country, so I'm very, very grateful to you for accepting this bilingual dialogue. The first question that you asked me, मैंने ये किताब क्यों लिखी? See, the reason is very clear. When I was in 2018, as late as 2018, I never thought I'll write a biography of Deve Gowda. But around 2018 and closer to the 2019 election, when I was looking at the centralization impulse that was there in the existing government, that is the BJP government, sabko kendrikrit karna, around one person, around one party, around Delhi, then I thought that, we need to find an alternative to this. And that I thought was the federal alternative. That is, India is often described as the union of states. So I thought a federal alternative is the real alternative to India, because India is a very diverse country. आज हम दो भाषा में बात कर रहे हैं. So it's a very diverse country. It's not something that can be held together by one culture, one language, one mindset, or one ideology. So I was looking at a federal alternative, and I thought I should write something on this aspect. But then I thought to pursue it theoretically would make it very boring, to make it a very academic book. And you and I are journalists. We don't want to write boring books. We want people to read. We want people to read what we write. And therefore, I thought I should look at a metaphor that would capture this. And Mr. Deve Gowda came across to me as a great metaphor of federalism and Indian federalism. And, I had myself, you mentioned, Ashutosh, that you were not aware of so many aspects of Deve Gowda. Let me confess, I myself was not aware. It's only when I started digging, when I started looking at papers in the archives, when I started looking at parliamentary papers, when I started having a conversation with Mr. Deve Gowda, it's not very easy to have a conversation with Mr. Deve Gowda because he's not very trusting. So it took me a bit of time to make up my mind. And, I could have written a biography of Manmohan Singh. But that was also on the offer. When Penguin said, please write something, I could have written on Manmohan Singh. But then I found Manmohan Singh was a very, it was quite a boring kind of a personality, because he's a technocrat, essentially. And Deve Gowda was so colorful. He had seen so much of pain. He had seen so much of hate. He had been rejected. He had won. He had lost. And, when that whole life journey was more fascinating, as much fascinating as his political journey. Unka jo जीवन का जो ये था, that was itself very, very fascinating. So I thought he makes for a great biography subject. And I was very sure from the beginning that I don't want to judge this person. I want to write a narrative which allows readers to make the judgment themselves, where I don't say that he was ideologically correct here, he was ideologically wrong there. No, I just put him in a context. And I also thought it should be a book of history, because that phase, as you rightly said, the 70s, his relationship with Morarji, or his relationship with the Janata Party, or Chandrasekhar, all of that has not been captured. Whether we like what some people in our polity say or not, the fact is that the academia and the intelligentsia are largely focused on Nehru and Congress, and the rest of the prime ministers have been ignored. Even in the process of writing this book, Ashutosh, I discovered such fascinating things about Morarji. And that itself, he had been reduced to one sentence.
I know.
Right? Things like that. So
But
this is the reason.
Yeah. Sugata, you said that the Manmohan Singh's biography would have been very boring because there's hardly anything. He was a technocrat. But the fact is, in this book you have written that Deve Gowda knew nothing. He was a teetotaler, and he had no hobbies. He wasn't into the movies. He wasn't into the literature. He wasn't into the women. In fact, you have written he wasn't into the chasing women. And and he was quite contrast to what Ramkrishna Hegde was. Hegde was everything which Deve Gowda was not. So, so how political he was. He said that his only hobby was politics. He used to get up in the morning. He used to create something. By the night, he used to go to sleep. He used to destroy that.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Right. No, see, that is the political aspect of it, Ashutosh. You're right. He was a complete contrast to Ramkrishna Hegde or other leaders of his time who were, had a good life in the sense, they enjoyed their whiskey after 6 o'clock. See, and they sort of like to be in the company of good-looking people. So let's not elaborate on that because it became very controversial. But Deve Gowda was a very boring person in that sense because
and totally devoted to his wife. Totally
devoted to his wife, and so he was essentially a person who was boring in the regular sense of the word. But his struggle, his ability to create new ideas, which were fantastic. Big ideas. See, the finest of politicians come to the table with big ideas. And Deve Gowda had that ability to come to the table with big ideas. And then he would start lobbying for those ideas. And the manner in which he lobbied for those ideas would shake up the entire politics of Karnataka. So he was someone like that. And the other aspect, which was not so boring, but very, very something that created enormous curiosity in me, was that he was a very melancholic character. He was a little bit like, if you, I'm in America now, if you look at any of the American presidents, see, even Abraham Lincoln was a very melancholic character, he was not a very cheerful character, he used to be very dull and morose. And, Deve Gowda was similar. He's still like that. He's a very melancholic character, and there are reasons for that. There is a reason as to why he was melancholic like that. It probably comes from his father. So that melancholia, that sadness that he constantly, it's very difficult to get Deve Gowda to smile. And even more difficult to get him to laugh. So he was a very, very interesting person in that sense, and someone who, he always plowed the lonely furrow. He would keep an idea, he would work on that idea, go directly to the people. See, even before Modi started doing it, going directly to the people, because he did not trust media the way other prime ministers trusted. Deve Gowda was the first one who directly went to the media. Directly went to the people. Because he had a better conversation with them. And the media anyway was always dismissive of him because there were people like Nijlingappa and Deve and Ramakrishna Hegde and Virendra Patil in the Karnataka space who were always cornering the media. Deve Gowda, like Devraj Aras, one of the great chief ministers of Karnataka, had a similar treatment from the media for a very long time. And Deve Gowda continues to have that treatment. But Devraj Aras turned it around after a point of time. But Deve Gowda never bothered about it. And I think in the introduction you did say that he did not spend a single penny on public relations or image management. He was never bothered about it. I don't think there's any other politician who has done this in India. So he obviously, therefore, the media, now we have the digital media, thankfully, which looks at in-depth stories, tries to look at different layers of a story. But, the mainstream media had to be fed. And the mainstream media then and now has been very, very similar. It had to be fed with a few things. And that is something which Deve Gowda never did. And therefore, Deve Gowda was a little boring in one sense, but interesting and, made me curious in another sense.
Hello.
सुगता, एक तो पहला छोटा सवाल है और वो बहुत जरूरी सवाल है इस किताब के लिए, इसलिए पूछ रहा हूँ कि इस किताब का ट्रांसलेशन कितनी जुबानों में आप करवा रहे हैं, हो रहा है कि नहीं हो रहा है? क्योंकि जितना मैंने पढ़ा इस किताब को उस हिसाब से लगता है कि ये इंग्लिश में जो लोग पढ़ते हैं उनसे ज्यादा जरूरी है कि भारतीय भाषाओं में लोग इसको पढ़ें।
I'm so glad you asked that question, Alok ji. I mean, as of now, only it's getting translated into Kannada. I've not worked out anything with any other language, but I do see a lot of curiosity. For example, some people in Malayalam were interested. Somebody in Tamil was showing a lot of interest, but I don't think we have worked out anything as yet. Hindi obviously is a very good option. But as of now, it's happening in Kannada. अभी शुरू नहीं हुआ है। खाली कन्नड़ में हो रहा है, कन्नड़ा में हो रहा है।
तो आपकी किताब का जो सबसे जोरदार बात है, और ये कन्फेस कर लूं मैं कि किताब जब मेरे हाथ में आई, पेंगुइन ने भेजी, मुझे देख के लगा कि अरे क्या देवे गौड़ा की लाइफ में क्या पढ़ा जाएगा, और इतनी मोटी किताब आखिर क्या हो सकती। लेकिन जो आप इंट्रोडक्शन है वो अपने आप में बहुत बड़ी कहानी कह देता है। तो मेरा ख्याल अगर आप सिर्फ वो इंट्रोडक्शन को हिंदी में 2-4 अखबारों में छपवा देंगे तो इसकी हिंदी में आने लगेगी अच्छी किताब।
Thank you.
कह रहे हैं कि what is available now is an impatient, uninformed and prejudiced media construct which flatly portrays him as a shrewd arbiter of power, as a Philistine, as being clannish, dynastic and vindictive. He is put in the same category as some other Indian political patriarch and painted with the same broad brushstrokes of ignorance. This is not just unfair to Deve Gowda, but also to us and to our understanding of history and democracy. ये जो बात आप कह रहे हैं, इसके साथ में एक दूसरी लाइन लिखी हुई है उसी इंट्रोडक्शन में, एक सेंटेंस और है जो कहता है, इट इज नॉट दैट द पैन इंडिया नैरेटिव अबाउट गौड़ा इज ट्रंकेटेड। सिर्फ भारत के बाकी हिस्सों में गौड़ा के बारे में कम जानते हैं ऐसा नहीं है। इवन इन हिज ओन स्टेट ऑफ कर्नाटका his legacy is measured by the myopia of caste identity politics. ये जो देवे गौड़ा के साथ है, इसकी कोई खास वजह आपको लगती है कि देवे गौड़ा को इस चश्मे से देखा जाता है? मैं और इसमें थोड़ी आपकी हेल्प करूंगा कि मेरे जैसे आदमी के लिए जो उत्तर भारत में रहता है, जिसने देवे गौड़ा को प्राइम मिनिस्टर के तौर पे देखा और उसके बाद एक समय देखा कि साहब ये प्राइम मिनिस्टर वापस चीफ मिनिस्टर बनने की कोशिश कर रहा है, ये एक सरप्राइजिंग चीज थी। तो अब देवे गौड़ा अपने आप एक ऐसा पिक्चर पेंट हो जाती है कि बहुत ज्यादा इनके बारे में पढ़ने समझने की क्या जरूरत है। लेकिन जब आप किताब हम पढ़ते हैं तो समझ में आता है कि देवे गौड़ा एक बहुत लंबी लड़ाई लड़कर पहले मुख्यमंत्री की कुर्सी तक, उसके बाद प्रधानमंत्री की कुर्सी तक पहुंचे थे। ऐसा नहीं था जैसा हमको सबको उत्तर भारत में लगता है कि देवे गौड़ा को किस्मत से प्रधानमंत्री की कुर्सी क्योंकि बहुत सारे लोग लड़ रहे थे, उन्हें सूझा कि कोई और नहीं तो चलो देवे गौड़ा को बना दे। नहीं, ये जो पूरा सफर है ये क्यों इतना दबा छिपा रहता है और खास तौर पे कर्नाटक में क्यों दबा हुआ था?
Right. Thank you very much. That's a fantastic question. Why did Deve Gowda get ignored, or why is there a very impatient understanding of Deve Gowda? Is a question that I've been asked many times, and I often try to tell people that there are 2 or 3 major reasons for that. One is, of course, Deve Gowda is from the south of India, and being from the south of India, the north does not warm up to a person from the south as much as they warm up to somebody from a UP or a Bihar or a... See, it's about language. Today we are talking in English and Hindi, and there is a kind of linguistic kind of construct which sort of blocks him out. When compared to other people from the north. So he's from the south. There is very little understanding of the south, and south is a completely different country, in terms of cultures. There are many languages. Not everybody is a Madrasi. I'll be offended if I am told you're a Madrasi, because I'm a Kannadiga. So there is, all these are languages with histories of 2000 years, which is fabulous. And there are literatures in these languages. So one is he came from the south, and there was very little understanding of the south, and nobody had the patience to sort of, explore and find out what this man's background was and who this man was. So that is number one. That is the fact that he was from the south. The second thing is, we don't often recognize in India that there is a caste prejudice which I mean, even people who are extremely, well-read, or, and people who have progressed a lot, don't seem to drop very easily. There are very few people who sort of overcome that. So he was a person from the absolute bottom rung of the caste hierarchy. वो शूद्र थे, वो भारत का पहला शूद्र प्राइम मिनिस्टर भी थे, प्रधानमंत्री थे. See, there is a small debate whether Charan Singh was a shudra because he is a Jat. But the categorization of Jat as in the Varna hierarchy is not very clear, number one. And number two, Charan Singh never faced the parliament. Charan Singh was never confirmed by the parliament. So Deve Gowda becomes the first, Shudra Prime Minister of India, much ahead, an OBC Prime Minister, much ahead, 25 years ahead of Modi. So but Modi, when he becomes an OBC Prime Minister, he is not a representative of the OBCs. He is a representative of the RSS. He is a representative of an ideology. So therefore, he is lifted up by several forces. But Deve Gowda, unfortunately, was a loner in that sense. So he was a person who belonged to the Shudra community. He was also someone, Okaligas in Karnataka are landed people. But in the case of Deve Gowda, he did not even have land. He had 3 or 4 ragged acres. And there was extreme poverty that he was exposed to. His father was a very poor man, and he grew up as a very poor child and a young man. So there was no social capital, there was no cultural capital, and there was no real capital for Deve Gowda. So he was not, in the book I write, that he was not one of those people in old Mysore who wore a zari, peta, or a turban, a zari turban. A zari turban is an indication of your status in society. Ab wo jo zari ka peta lagate the, which would mean that you are part of the royal court, or you have achieved a certain status in life. So for Deve Gowda's family, there was only a white towel which they would tie around their head when they were plowing the field. And Deve Gowda continued with that all his life. Even after he became educated, he never wore a silk turban or a silk kurta or a pajama or a dhoti. He never sort of went into it. He was very comfortable in his cotton clothes. So caste and his lack of social capital were the second reason why he was not picked up. Because even in Karnataka at that time, like in any other state, the entire narrative was held together by the upper caste. And he did not belong to that. But the thing was, he was a fighter. He was right in the middle of people. He was, creating these big ideas around river basins. He was the patriarch of the Kaveri river basin, because he had helped shape the whole planning of the Kaveri, harnessing of the Kaveri river waters. So it could be Hemavati, Harangi. And as the first time legislator, he had brought a resolution in the assembly to complete the works on the Kaveri basin, and which is very unusual. And it is to date, it is the only resolution brought by a private member or an independent member which has been passed by the state legislature. And that was the stubbornness of Deve Gowda. So once he latched on to a certain idea, he would never give it up. So it is that stubbornness which made him survive in politics. But there were other disadvantages like caste. There was a class issue. He was not, from the upper caste or upper class. And then he was from the south of India. And then when he comes to Delhi, he is not a Hindi speaker. And there is another factor which is very, very, shocking and really something that needs to be condemned, which is the Anglophone media, jo English ka intellectuals hai, or the English patrakar the, they tried to dismiss him as someone who did not know Hindi or English. In fact, the most important books that were written in that phase, or the newspaper commentary, if you look at it now, they say Deve Gowda does not know English. But then, if you notice, if you read in my book, I've spoken to Montek Singh Ahluwalia, I've spoken to Chidambaram, and if you look at the archives from the 70s, you will find it's for everybody to see. You will see communication that Deve Gowda has done in English with all the national leaders of the Janata Party. It's in longhand. and you can't find a grammatical error. Of course, he did not speak Queen's English. See, अंग्रेजी बात करना और अंग्रेजी लिखना वो दोनों अलग चीज है. So लिखना, he was very comfortable. He understood, and he sort of could do some basic communication in English, but he did not speak a language of people who had returned from Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard. So they categorized him as a बुद्धू तरीका है, किसान का नेता है, ये he's like other people in Haryana or Bihar. But the fact is, when he was a young person, his father, who was again unlettered, वो पढ़े नहीं थे, but he had his ambition to educate his son in English. Right. So he goes looking for an English tutor, finds a Protestant, person, a clergyman, and gets him English medium education in those days.
Okay.
And Deve Gowda's English is fantastic. His reading habits he never discloses because he's a mass person. He wants to hide his reading, but he has the ability to negotiate in English, I think, much more than a Vajpayee or any other Hindi-speaking prime minister, even Modi.
जी, आपने एक चीज और सुगता, मेरी आपकी, क्योंकि इस किताब पर एक ट्विटर पे एक डिबेट हुई छोटी सी, तो वो बात मैं यहाँ इस दर्शकों के सामने लाना जरूरी समझता हूँ. मैंने लिखा कि ये द लाइफ स्टोरी ऑफ इंडियाज फर्स्ट एक्सीडेंटल प्राइम मिनिस्टर.
राइट, यस.
जिसके जवाब में आपने कहा कि साहब, अगर देवे गौड़ा एक्सीडेंटल हैं तो फिर भारत के सारे प्रधानमंत्री एक्सीडेंटल हैं, जवाहरलाल नेहरू छोड़कर. इसको आप एलेबोरेट करेंगे?
Fantastic. Yeah, see, Nehru was by the time he became prime minister, he was almost a nominee of the Congress party and Mahatma Gandhi. So everybody knew he would take over the mantle, but there was still some confusion about Patel. But then we now know Patel had, receded and taken a back step, and Nehru was almost confirmed as the prime minister. So that was one prediction that you could make, that Nehru will take over the prime ministership of India. And there was a long story of the Constituent Assembly, and we knew that he will become the first prime minister. That's right. But if you look at the second prime minister of India, Lal Bahadur Shastri, I don't think there was any prediction. Nehru dies, and suddenly a few names are before the syndicate, and they suddenly consider Lal Bahadur Shastri. Now in hindsight, you may say Nehru had hinted, the Congress wanted this and all that, but he was still an accidental prime minister who unfortunately did great work in 2 years, but dies equally suddenly with him. And Indira Gandhi also, to be fair to Indira Gandhi, the name was, maneuvered in such a way that she becomes an alternative, because there were other players at that time. If they had sort of asserted or, tried to do a few things, she wouldn't have been thought of as a Gungi Gudiya. They thought that she will be a lame duck prime minister and we can manipulate her. So it was in the interest of the patriarchs of the Congress party to have Indira Gandhi, but then she evolves into her own. So Indira Gandhi was also accidental in some sense, because she was seen as beneficial to a few people, very powerful people in the Congress party. Could be Kamraj, could be others. So she was thought of like that. And then after her, Rajiv Gandhi becomes the prime minister. And Morarji. So Morarji in 77 becomes the prime minister, and Morarji was past his date. He was already 80, 82. Yeah, and he was from the Congress, and nobody thought that he would be sort of pushed. It was again decided in the Gandhi Peace Foundation in Delhi that it should be Morarji. It was a set of people who sit down and decide that we need administrative experience, we need someone with a very different kind of profile, and they pick Morarji. And so that is also because there are too many factors and they have to hold things together. So Morarji is also an accidental prime minister, according to me. And then you have Rajiv Gandhi, who never thought he will be in politics in the first place. And nobody thought Indira Gandhi would be assassinated in that fashion. So we don't know what would have happened. He was there to fill up this space, but one did not know that he will be prime minister. And when he is trying to be prime minister, now if you read Pranab Mukherjee's autobiography and other autobiographies or political commentary written around that time, there were other suggestions too as to who should be the prime minister. So he emerges, and they suddenly, move him into the move him to the Rashtrapati Bhavan and he's sworn in, and Zail Singh is not a very happy person with that. Right, the president then. So then he goes, and then you have Chandrasekhar. Chandrasekhar has been there in the field, but then he holds VP Singh again. He rebels from the Congress setup and becomes the prime minister. And nobody had ever thought of him because he was a very loyal congressman. If you look at VP Singh papers during the emergency time, he compares Sanjay Gandhi to Vivekananda. He was that loyal to the Congress party. So nobody thought he would rebel. And so he just plucks the whole thing out and he comes out and he becomes prime minister. So he's again accidental. Then if you look at Chandrasekhar, I don't have to tell you about Chandrasekhar.
And Narasimha Rao also.
Narasimha Rao was ready to leave.
मैं सुगता इस सवाल का दूसरा जो पार्ट है उस पे आना चाहता हूँ असल में, क्योंकि देखिए ऐसे तो आप सबको गिना देंगे। क्या देवे गौड़ा प्रधानमंत्री बनना चाहते थे कि नहीं बनना चाहते थे, और उन्होंने वहां पहुंचने के लिए कोई काम किया, कोशिश की या नहीं की?
No, देवे गौड़ा बिल्कुल नहीं चाहते थे कि वो प्रधानमंत्री बने, because if you look at the papers of Mr. Jyoti Basu, the oral archives of Mr. Jyoti Basu in the Nehru Memorial Library and Archives, it is very, very clear that Deve Gowda is pleading with Mr. Jyoti Basu and Harkishan Singh Surjit, मुझे मत बनाइए क्योंकि मैं आप जैसे 20 साल के लिए कर्नाटक का मुख्यमंत्री रहना चाहता हूं, आप जैसे काम करना चाहता हूं. He was 20 years older, right? Jyoti Basu was senior to him in politics and in age and all that. And when Jyoti Basu is not relenting, he catches hold of his feet. उनका पाँव पड़ता है और बोलते हैं कि मुझे मत बनाइए, please. And then Jyoti Basu becomes very angry. He says, see, you don't give me other names in your party. I know about them. You don't, I mean, especially there is a very small line in Jyoti Basu's oral archives, very interestingly says, रामकृष्ण हेगड़े खड़े थे उस कॉर्नर में, मैंने उनको देखा और बोला आप बन जाइए, and he understood the sarcasm. So he was very clear because Jyoti Basu was very clear that Deve Gowda should be prime minister because he had seen him work from the 70s. See, I give a small instance that Deve Gowda was the finest chairman of the Public Accounts Committee in Karnataka because he was the opposition leader also. So he goes to Assam in the 70s, where Jyoti Basu, Jyotirmoy Basu, and all the left leaders, they're all meeting in Assam, and it's a conference of Public Accounts Committee chairpersons from all the states of India. And in that, Jyoti Basu and Jyotirmoy Basu, who's also a CPM MP those days, they are he's delivering the keynote address. And Deve Gowda is an unknown character. He's sitting somewhere in the back and nobody knows he's part of the conference also. In the keynote address, Jyotirmoy Basu says, you've all come here. I'm very happy that you all come here, but you should all work like this one person in the south, in Karnataka, who is making pasina chura raha hai. I mean, Devraj Aras ka, he's making Devraj Aras sweat every day. And that man is some Gowda. You should all work like Deve Gowda. And he works with documents. He brings big files to the assembly and puts it on the floor of the assembly and starts revealing, data and statistics and all things that are going against Devraj Aras. So you should all learn to function like him. So Deve Gowda, who's sitting in the back row, is surprised that his name is being taken and incorrectly. His pronunciation is, he's being called something, Gowda or something like that.
Gowda.
And then Gowda or something like that. More plausible, it's Gowda. So during the lunch break, being the humble farmer that he goes and does a namaste. And he says, sir, you were referring to me in your speech. I am that Gowda. And that is when they hug him and they say, you've done marvelous work. And the relationship starts between the left leaders of those days and Deve Gowda and other people in the national space. So Jyoti Basu has been watching Deve Gowda and the kind of work that he has been doing. And as chief minister, Jyoti Basu and Harkishan Singh Surjit, who was the general secretary of the CPM, They go to Karnataka in 2005, early 2005, and this is for the national executive of the CPM. There's a huge meeting that has been organized. And it so happens that the local general secretary of the party comes to Deve Gowda and he says, "Saab, ये तो organize किया हमने, 2 दिन के लिए हमारा पास पैसा है, to feed people, everybody. तीसरा दिन के लिए कुछ पैसा नहीं है, थोड़ा help कीजिए हमको." So Deve Gowda, being that natural whatever thing, he says, "Don't worry, 3rd day I will take a खाने का इंतजाम हम कर लेंगे, don't worry about it." So Deve Gowda takes care of the catering for 3rd day when Jyoti Basu and Surjit are there. And then after that, Deve Gowda says, "I'll host a dinner exclusively for Jyoti Basu." Anyway, he's a chief minister who's come. He's a man I respect. And that is the first time that Harkishan Singh Surjit meets Deve Gowda. Jyoti Basu has met him earlier, but Harkishan Singh Surjit is there. And then Deve Gowda gives the finest presentation of what work he is doing to them. So they are surprised. Here is a chief minister who has called us for dinner. And before dinner, he's giving me a presentation of the works he's doing, the policies he's trying to bring about. He was the first one to bring reservation for Muslim minorities in Karnataka. So he gives him the economic logic behind that. So Jyoti Basu is completely impressed that this is a man who has to be watched. And he says, "Chinta mat kijiye, aap 20 saal Mukhyamantri rahenge Karnataka ka."
Sugata,
So now, yes.
you have given a very elaborate description of Mr. H.D. Deve Gowda. But when he was a prime minister,
yes,
Deve Gowda बार-बार अपने को कहते थे, "I'm a humble farmer."
Yes.
I'm a humble farmer. और लोगों को
Yes.
लगता था कि शायद वो अंग्रेजी उनको नहीं आती है. और वो उनकी एक दूसरी तस्वीर थी कि वो सोते रहते थे, आंखें बंद करके सो जाते थे वो. तो लोग लगता था ये, एंड देन लोग कहते थे कि 3 बजे रात तक पॉलिटिक्स करते हैं, सुबह 5 बजे फिर उठ जाते हैं, तो he has no time to sleep.
Right.
But important thing is, in your book, you have very categorically mentioned that the way he organized his office, the PMO, the way he organized his office, and the way he used to clear files. I think बहुत सारे लोगों को इसका अंदाजा नहीं है. उनको लगता है कि देवे गौड़ा एक्सीडेंटली प्राइम मिनिस्टर बन गए, उन्होंने तो कुछ ज्यादा काम किया नहीं है.
Right.
How did he organize his office, and how the PMO used to function them, and who were the people who were important? I think if you could tell, then I think our viewers will be very enlightened to know that here was a man who is so underestimated, and people know so little about him as a prime minister.
Thank you, Ashutosh. That's a very good question. See, he was underrated, but he was never underprepared. Because he was a great administrator. Even in Karnataka today, if you ask anybody, they may not like a certain aspect of Deve Gowda, but they will say he was the finest administrator. He knew how to organize his office even as a chief minister. And when he becomes prime minister, even as prime minister designate, he's very clear as to who his principal secretary should be. So he picks a Satish Chandran, who has been the chief secretary of Karnataka 10 years ago. And interestingly, he was chief secretary for Ramakrishna Hegde. Okay. So he has worked with him, and he was the power secretary in Delhi. And he has retired, and he is working with the Ghorpades at that point of time. So, and he's a man of impeccable integrity. But the connection between Satish Chandran and Deve Gowda has got nothing to do with administration or other aspects. Both of them were engineers. So they understood each other's mind. See, Satish Chandra was the first engineer IAS officer, if you don't know. And he studied in the Indian Institute of Science, a premier institute at that time. So Deve Gowda could talk a technical language to Satish Chandra, and Satish Chandra would answer in a technical language. See, nobody knows that Deve Gowda is a first-rate planner of river basins. He can do a sketch himself in 24 hours and give you a solution. So he was a technical man, and here was a Satish Chandra with whom he had enormous respect because of his age, one, and two, because of his integrity and credibility that he had maintained. So he brings in Satish Chandra, and then as chief minister, he has Meenakshi Sundaram, who is his principal secretary, who is from Tamil Nadu again. See, there was this whole myth that was floated at that time that the entire PMO is made up of Karnataka people. It is not true. If you look at if you look at Meenakshi Sundaram, if you look at Satish Chandran, who was above all that, and then he gives an extension to this man who's, Satya Nadela's father, who was in the Prime Minister's office at that time. He says he's retiring, but he is a great expert on rural development. So he gives an extension to Mr. Satya. I mean, his name is not, coming back to me immediately.
Sugata, sorry, I'm interrupting you, but I think
there
is a line in your book where he says that the people from all parts of the region, India, should be there,
be represented. Yeah, that is the one-line brief that he gives. That is the one-line brief when after Satish Chandran and Meenakshi Sundaram and Yugandhar. That Yugandhar is the name.
Father of the Satya Nadela's.
Satya Nadela's father. So when these three people are confirmed, they are the three pillars. Then he gives a one-line brief to Yugandhar and Satish Chandran. Now go and get people from every corner of India. And the reason he gives is that kal hame kuch problem ho jaye from some area, we should be able to react to that in a constructive way, in a positive way, and with a lot of knowledge. So I don't want everybody from the south or from the north. So that is how he picks an officer from Mizoram. He picks an officer from, far-flung Chhattisgarh, Uttar Pradesh, everywhere, and then builds the most diverse Prime Minister's office. So, I don't think we have had such a diverse Prime Minister's office ever. If you look at the Prime Minister's office now, today, you have only Gujarat cadre officers. People who have served Mr. Modi for a very long time, and they have been inducted into the Prime Minister's office. In Deve Gowda's case, everybody was new. He had not worked with anybody like Mr. Modi had worked with somebody, or Nehru had worked with his officers, Iyengar and others. So this man was absolutely fresh in his approach. So he says, let's get everybody from every corner, so that, see, those were the days when you didn't have an internet. You did not have a mobile phone, right? And problems would be coming up from every corner. And how do you respond to that? Basic jankari ke liye koi to hona chahiye wahan, jo aapko ठीक-ठाक information de and give you a right counsel. So he created that kind of a thing and that was the finest, diverse Prime Minister's office that India has ever seen. In fact, if you read T.S.R. Subramaniam, who was another very fine officer,
he was a cabinet secretary.
He was a cabinet secretary, and he represented the government. And Satish Chandran represented the Prime Minister. See, that is the division of labor that we have in our system, where Satish Chandran and T.S.R. Subramaniam are made to face each other and argue against each other on every issue. And both of them were the finest officers. And T.S.R. Subramaniam writes in his book, which he, the first book that he wrote, that Deve Gowda was probably the finest Prime Minister, administrative Prime Minister that India has seen. He writes that because he says the manner in which this man could approach a file, he had not seen any other Chief Minister or Prime Minister who could write a note like that. And every note would come handwritten. See, if you look at Prime Ministers, they don't write on the files because they're afraid tomorrow kal kuch ho jaye, or they are, caught in the whole thing. But Deve Gowda, I've put a few plates in the book where Deve Gowda is the only Prime Minister who would write a note on the file, which is unusual because politicians are very afraid to write themselves because it can create some kind of a controversy later or whatever. They write very short notes. But Deve Gowda wrote long, elaborate notes on what he wanted, how he wanted certain things to move, especially if you look at the Northeast files. He's telling you clearly what is now attributed to Vajpayee. Honestly, was all written and documented by Deve Gowda. I'm not saying this because I like Deve Gowda or I've written the biography of Deve Gowda. Anybody can go and access the files. Anybody can go and see the archives.
But Sugata, बहुत सारे लोगों को ये पता नहीं है कि देवे गौड़ा की सरकार गई क्यों? Why did it fall? Is it because of some insecurity, or is it because of the CBI? Because in your book, in your book, you write that the one mistake which Deve Gowda has made was appointment of Mr. Joginder Singh as the director of the CBI.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it was, you also hinted that this appointment has led to the fall of his government. Was it true?
Correct. Absolutely true, because Joginder Singh was a kind of figure who sort of lost his balance after he was appointed. And it was even TSR Subramaniam and Satish Chandran warned Deve Gowda, don't appoint this fellow, because he has no requisite experience. He has no executive experience or investigative experience. He is someone who has held, postings which are not, which will not make him a suitable CBI person. But then Deve Gowda succumbs to some recommendation from his home minister from Karnataka, that is Mr. PGR Sindhya. So Sindhya is his right-hand man in Karnataka, who has, been very close to him at that point of time. It's another story that he rebels later. But he goes by the recommendation of Sindhya and appoints Joginder Singh. And Joginder Singh is absolute chaos. And see, today, a prime minister would have intervened and stopped him and shouted at him. But at that point of time, a lot of CBI cases were being monitored by the Supreme Court. Like it could be the Lalu Prasad case also, the Chara Gotala case or whatever. And there were very eminent justices of the Supreme Court like J.S. Verma who were directly monitoring. And even if a prime minister tried to change an officer here and there would be a complete backlash in the Supreme Court. So Deve Gowda had a very robust Supreme Court which was monitoring the administration and the cases that were before it. And so he had very little legroom. He could not change a CBI director once he realized that this was a bad choice. It was not an easy thing to do, and he did not have a majority in the House. It would become a huge issue in the Parliament, and it would be a huge issue in the cabinet because it was a 13-party coalition. So the question of changing him became remote. So this man is like a bull in a china shop. He is going to Stockholm. He's going abroad, bringing those papers. वो काली डब्बा ले आता है. मगर वो जब दिखाता है, he pastes this Bofors papers on it and he starts showing it when he alights from the aeroplane in the middle of the night. So he creates chaos which Deve Gowda is squirming inside, but he does not know how to sort of handle it. And then parallelly, Sitaram Kesri there are other people in the United Front government who are trying to fix Sitaram Kesri. And those people are not from Deve Gowda's cabinet or Deve Gowda's party. For example, if you remember, Ashutosh, you will very well remember, the Congress party faced an election for its president's post, which had never happened. And Rajesh Pilot was someone who wanted to contest against him. Sharad Pawar wanted to contest. And these people were trying to lobby with Deve Gowda to sort of handle Sitaram Kesri for them. In fact, such a Rajesh Pilot, goes with a 9-page letter to Deve Gowda and he says, "Ye karwaiye," because this man, revived that case of that murder case against him. And he says, "What are you telling me? If I do this, my government is gone. It's over." And he just tears it up in front of Pilot and puts it into the dustbin. But it so happens 3 days later that same thing appears in the Indian Express. So that becomes the beginning of the fall of this government. And then there are players like Pranab Mukherjee who are waiting for an opportunity and they're drafting letters after letter for Kesri to withdraw support for Deve Gowda's thing. And Pranab Mukherjee is doing it to counter-check a person like Sharad Pawar, who is, in some alignment with Deve Gowda. And Sharad Pawar wants to move away with 70 MPs or 72 MPs, crossover and save the Deve Gowda government. That is the kind of rumor that was doing the rounds at that time, that Sharad Pawar will break away. We don't have to worry about Sitaram Kesri and Sitaram Kesri can be dumped. So that is the kind of logic that is prevalent at that time. And there are people inside the Congress. It could be Das Munshi, it could be Pilot, it could be Pranab Mukherjee, and a whole lot of players who are trying to dismantle the Congress regime, not the Congress party thing, establishment, not Deve Gowda. But Deve Gowda becomes a casualty of that politics within the Congress. So nobody says this. They all attribute it to Deve Gowda, CBI. See, Deve Gowda gave no instruction. It was very clear. Today it's 25 years. The files are declassified. There is no instruction that is available. There is nothing of that sort. Of course, this man was an idiot who was running in his own, steam and whatever. But Deve Gowda, yes, there were political interests. Deve Gowda had become very ambitious. See, in 3 or 4 months, he realized that he had the grip of the administration. And he thought he can unite the Kisans of India to in case there is a problem with the Congress. He wanted to dissolve the parliament and go to elections. And he thought he will win, because by then he was a hero in Western UP. I mean, Tikayat was on his side. Ajit Singh was on his side. So he thought he can do it. So there was also this hubris, and there were a few people like CM Ibrahim who were, loose talkers. They spoke a language which did not befit a regime that was on a kind of this short leash.
Sugata, I think we are running short of time. I'll ask just a small question, then I'll hand over to Alok. The small question is that you have mentioned in your book that when Atal Bihari Vajpayee had offered him to support the government, the BJP wanted to support Deve Gowda government, but it is the same Deve Gowda whose son takes the support of the BJP and forms the government. And you had written in your book कि उसके बाद देवे गौड़ा जो है वो डिप्रेशन में चले जाते हैं, और वो ऐसा क्यों था? क्योंकि जो नॉर्मल कॉन्वर्सेशन है, जो नॉर्मल इंफॉर्मेशन लोगों के पास है नॉर्थ इंडिया में, दिल्ली में, कि देवे गौड़ा ने जो है वो नाटक किया, देखो कुमारस्वामी ने मुझसे बगावत कर ली, और बट इट वाज ऑल डन विद द हेल्प ऑफ देवे गौड़ा. देवे गौड़ा वांटेड एन अलायंस with the BJP to form the government and make his son Kumaraswamy as the chief minister. But your book refutes all that.
No, it's. I mean, I'm absolutely clear about what happens with Deve Gowda at that point of time, because see, Deve Gowda it's a public insult to Deve Gowda, because he has been the tallest secular leader, at least in his mind. He has not compromised with Vajpayee. He has not compromised at other bends. See, in 99, Ramakrishna Hegde has already gone with BJP. J.H. Patel, a socialist, he's already gone with BJP. George Fernandes, a socialist from Karnataka, is already in alliance with NDA. But Deve Gowda is firm. And if you read Madhu Dandavate, it becomes very clear how steadfast Deve Gowda was to the secular cause around 99, when all of them were deserting the UPA or the secular cause. So in 2006 also, Deve Gowda is completely upset that his son has gone away. And I speak from medical records. I have quoted the blood pressure levels, and he becomes very violent, and he loses his gait. Deve Gowda always stood erect. He loses his gait. Thoda hunch aa jata hai unka personality mein, and he does not know how to face the public. In fact, there's one aspect which I have not written in the book, where Deve Gowda returns to parliament after 8 months. He's very insulted, and Somnath Chatterjee gives him an opportunity to speak. And that speech, I regret, I have not recorded enough of that because it comes much later. And my book stops at 2004. So he makes this very impassioned speech as to how he was betrayed. That speech is there in the parliamentary record. And Deve Gowda is never the same after that. He loses control. His son has hijacked the party. But he maneuvers again. By 2008, he decides that the power will not be transferred to BJP. As a result of which, there is such a big backlash that his party sits out of power for 10 years. And which politician would want to sit out of power for 10 years? He knows, as a shrewd politician, that there will be a backlash for this in Karnataka, but he still goes ahead with it. And in 2018, the BJP and the Congress want him to join them in alliance, but he goes with the Congress. And if you remember, he assembled all the leaders or secular leaders in Karnataka for the swearing in. Hello? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So he assembles all the secular leaders of India in Karnataka for the swearing in of his son in 2018. And privately, he told me that that was his moment of revenge. That was his moment when he told the world again, see, I am the same old Deve Gowda. It was my son who had strayed. I brought him back, and now I am getting him to commit himself in front of Sonia Gandhi, Mayawati, Sitaram Yechuri. Everybody is there for that swearing-in ceremony in Bangalore. And in 2019, I write about that. Modi pulls him aside during the Niti Aayog meeting, and he says, don't listen to your father. Your father is stuck in the old mindset of the Congress mindset में है वो, आप उनको उसको निकालिए आपका दिमाग से, आप आ जाइए हमारा साथ. Let's form a government tomorrow, and I'll put you on the job for full 5 years. And then Kumaraswamy says, sir, my father is 90, and I don't want to hurt him at this age. So just pardon me. And he just moves, because he knows what has happened inside the family. जो family का dynamics, which I did not write because it's too private, and there is no evidence to write about it. The family का अंदर जो हुआ, Kumaraswamy gets completely isolated. He becomes a persona non grata inside the family. So he also needs emotional support. So he comes back into the family, and the family takes him back with the condition that the father is not confronted with such difficult choices again. So these are things that people will not believe when we tell them. But even I don't write about it because it would shake the foundations of my book without writing that without evidence. But if you look at the sequence of events, and as journalists, we always look at the sequence of events, circumstantial evidence. I will give Deve Gowda the benefit of doubt, and I don't think it was natak. And if that was natak, 1997 April, Jashwant Singh comes with that chitti saying, don't do it. Deve Gowda, Vajpayee is putting pressure to through Bala Sahib Thackeray. He's putting pressure through Sahib Singh Verma. Ram Jethmalani just barges into the Prime Minister's office and he says, you're an idiot. What are you doing? Why are you resigning? Vajpayee ka jo hai support le lo, baad mein dekha jaye. And Jashwant Singh is pleading with him. And I quote Shrikant Jana, who was his parliamentary affairs minister at that time, who is the one who is the custodian of that chit written by Vajpayee. He has it with him. And he brings that to Deve Gowda, and Deve Gowda says, no question. I was still suspicious about this, Ashutosh. So I asked Chidambaram Sam, who was his finance minister, sir, this is being told to me by 2 or 3 sources. And when I interviewed them for my book, are you aware of it? He said, one thing I can tell you, Deve Gowda told me about Vajpayee's offer, and within a second he said, there is no question of accepting it, Chidambaram ji. Tomorrow I am going to resign. I am going to face the parliament and I will resign. So even Chidambaram confirms that Deve Gowda was steadfast in his commitment to the secular cause and never went with. And what happens after that, you have seen. Godra, he is the only person going and sitting in Muslim camps and writing letter after letter to Vajpayee. Vajpayee ka jo Raj Dharm ka comment tha, it was not provoked by anything else. It was provoked by the letters that Deve Gowda were written, which is part of Vajpayee papers. And nobody has reported on that. And the longest speeches in the parliament on Godra is by Deve Gowda. 1 hour, 1.5 hours. Nobody has reported on that. That's the sad part. It's not been documented well.
Hello.
No. अब आखिरी सवाल होगा मेरा ख्याल है, हालांकि एक किस्सा और है जिस पे रोशनी होनी चाहिए थी कि एपीजे अब्दुल कलाम को साइंटिफिक एडवाइजर एक्सटेंशन देने का फैसला देवे गौड़ा ने किया, तमाम एडवाइस के अगेंस्ट किया, और अगर वो नहीं करते तो शायद एपीजे अब्दुल कलाम लाइमलाइट में नहीं, और फिर शायद वो प्रेसिडेंट नहीं बन पाते. लेकिन उससे ज्यादा बड़ा सवाल एक है मेरे पास, जब नरेंद्र मोदी प्रधानमंत्री बने, उनकी पार्टी की जीत के साथ ही देवे गौड़ा ने इस्तीफा देने का फैसला किया. उन्होंने कहा था कि अगर बीजेपी जीत जाएगी तो मैं इस संसद में नहीं रहूंगा. इसके बाद मोदी जी ने उनको मना लिया, बात की, वो इस्तीफा देने गए थे, लेकिन उन्होंने कर लिया कि नहीं, आप रहिए, आपके अनुभव की, एक्सपीरियंस की हमको बहुत जरूरत है. इसके बावजूद देवे गौड़ा एनआरसी के खिलाफ प्रदर्शन करने के लिए खड़े हो जाते हैं. उनकी इच्छा थी कि वो जाएं और पूर्वोत्तर के राज्यों में जाकर, और वहां वो खुद करते हैं कि मनमोहन सिंह बहुत लंबे समय तक उस इलाके को रिप्रेजेंट करते हैं, उनको जाना चाहिए था, वो जाने की हालत में नहीं है, वो इस स्थिति में नहीं है, लेकिन मैं तो जा सकता हूँ. तो आज के देवे गौड़ा इस वक्त भी वो अपनी राजनीतिक जो जिसको कहते हैं राजनीतिक जज्बा है उनका, जो जुनून है, वो बना हुआ है, कायम है, आज भी वो लड़ाई लड़ने के लिए तैयार खड़े।
Right. Absolutely. I think he still thinks, Alokji, I should disclose this thing. I had a conversation with him 15 days or 20 days back before I came to the United States. So he was telling me that, see, I made that speech in Parliament that I will rise like a phoenix from the ashes to save this country. He says that moment has still not come, and therefore I am still not dead. I mean, there is something else that I have to do for this country. Isliye main zinda hu. He believes it. He believes very strongly that there is some last thing that he has to do for this country to keep it together or whatever. But I mean, he believes in astrology. He believes in God. He's a very religious man. It's very interesting. See, I'm not a believer. I'm a complete non-believer and an atheist who wrote the biography of a complete theist. So that's the contradiction. But this thing he believes even to this day, Alokji, that he has some unfinished task, and it was God who made him speak in Parliament like that main utke aungi, that I will sort of come from the ashes and become a phoenix. So he still thinks that moment has not come, and he's alive only for that moment. So something may happen. So in fact, he was telling me, I don't know if he meant it that way, but he said, you are going to the States, but you should read the biography of FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He said he could rule the country from a wheelchair. So the age is not a factor, is what he was telling me. So I really don't know what is in his mind, but he doesn't speak so openly.
But so then fascinating. It's really fascinating. I think, Sugata, we had many book reviews, but I think yours today, it's so with so much emotions, with so much passion, you've spoken about your protagonist. I think it's amazing. I think it's very good, and I'll recommend everybody जो उत्तर भारत के लोग हैं कि कम से कम वो एच टी देवे गौड़ा की इस किताब को जरूर पढ़े, और जो बातें अभी सुगत ने बताई हैं वो अद्भुत बातें हैं। इसमें आपको बहुत सारी चीजें मिलेंगी, जैसे हम लोग रामकृष्ण हेगड़े के, हमने तो अभी पूछा भी नहीं कि रामकृष्ण हेगड़े देवे गौड़ा का रिश्ता क्या था, कि चंद्रशेखर फोन करते हैं, बोलते तुमको रामकृष्ण हेगड़े को मुख्यमंत्री बनाना है, और रामकृष्ण हेगड़े ने चुनाव भी नहीं लड़ा था, एंड हियर वाज अ मैन हु वाज क्लेमेंट फॉर द सीट, और वो जाते हैं और रामकृष्ण हेगड़े को बनाते हैं, उनके लिए चुनाव लड़ाते हैं, वही रामकृष्ण हेगड़े बैक स्टैप करते हैं। बहुत सारे किस्से, बहुत पूरी कर्नाटक की राजनीति, देश की राजनीति समझना है, इस किताब को जरूर पढ़ें। So thank you so much for being so passionate about the book, about your character. Thank you so much. I think it was wonderful.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Thank you, Ashutosh and Alok ji, for organizing this show, because I'm a non-Hindi speaker and you still accommodate